I just want to check with the technical team that we can start because it's 5:01. Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. Some of you physically here in the room and many of you online. So thank you for spending some time of your Monday afternoon/evening dedicated to this important topic. Some of you perhaps know that I work on the topic of digital policy, and I usually start with the view of that technology has become an enabler in our lives, because I believe it has enabled democracy by making sure we break some of those physical barriers. And I think today, through this hybrid meeting, we see exactly that. But in the same time, technology has also enabled those who use it for malign purposes. And disinformation is one such example. Propaganda is definitely not a new phenomenon, but technology has facilitated those malign actors to spread and amplify narratives that undermine trust in our free societies. And in that sense, disinformation is in a way a cancer for our democracies. When we, for example, look at Putin's war in Ukraine, I think the underlying cause is his fear of our freedoms and democracies and our ability to choose our own destiny and our own leaders. And I think Putin, in a way, fears Ukraine because he fears his sovereignty, and he knows that if Ukraine succeeds, the Russian people might start to ask why they can't have the same freedom. So whether it's the war in Ukraine, whether we talk about election meddling, whether it's cyber attacks that strike our institutions or state-sponsored kleptocracy, I think these are all part of autocratic playbook to undermine our democracy. Some of you might know that we are holding this meeting because at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I urged the European Commission to create a war room for tackling the onslaught of disinformation. Disinformation that was targeted at Ukrainians to sow fear and confusion. Disinformation targeted at the West to create a moral equivalence between Russia and NATO. And disinformation targeted at Russians to hide Putin's war crimes and bolster the dictator's position. And I believe one of the reasons why we are also summoned here today is because we must tackle all of these disinformations that I've mentioned. But in doing so, we must not crush free speech or silence opinion, because this is particularly what Putin expects us that can happen. And this is why I think instead we must ask what more we can do to boost our own resilience, to create a population that is savvy to how disinformation works, to try and basically turn every European into a fact checker, equipped with the tools and the skills to find out the truth, even if it's inconvenient. And we must assess the role and its responsibilities also of platforms that we have, some of them invited here today. Some of you, and if not all of you, I'm sure probably know that just this weekend we finalized the last details on the Digital Services Act. But I think legislation alone cannot be the silver bullet to tackle disinformation, because democracy only works if we have a shared demos, not segmented echo chambers with our own separate truths. We have tried to explain how we foresee today's meeting to work. We would like it to be more like a congressional hearing. So we are not looking into having long speeches. Rather, the aim today is for my colleagues that are here in the room and the ones that are joining us online to ask short and pertinent questions, and for our distinguished speakers to give short and clear answers, because I believe this sort of forum today could help us find some of the answers we all seek. Today's event is an EPP group meeting on disinformation, and I'm very sorry to mention that unfortunately our group leader Manfred Weber is no longer unable to join us, but he will be updated and debriefed by me once he returns to Parliament later this week or next week in Strasbourg. But having said that, we have a wide range of speakers and also not a lot of time. So the way we are going to hold today's meetings is I will introduce each speaker and then we'll jump straight into short questions from the MEP panel. But before that, I would like to introduce the Foreign Minister of Lithuania, Minister Landsbergis, who is currently on a working overseas trip, but he has kindly sent us some video remarks. So I would like to ask our technical team if you could please play Landsbergis' video, and then we'll proceed with the speakers. Thank you. Our technical team is trying to fix. Okay, we'll give it another try a little bit later, perhaps. Apologies for the delay. But I believe as we also have a number of colleagues here with us for the first panel, I believe we can go to our first speaker and open the first panel discussion, the creation of EU disinformation room. So I would like to welcome Lutz Gunner, the head of division for strategic communications at the European Action Service, who's joining us from Brussels, but he is tuning online. So Lutz, before we go to you, I have a line of colleagues who have asked for the floor. And I would first like to invite our colleague Sandra Cauniete, who has been the rapporteur for the Special Committee on Foreign Interference and Disinformation, as well as member of the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Association Committee. Sandra, over to you for your questions to Lutz.
Thank you very much, and it's a true pleasure to see you once again, because we have been together for almost 18 months. You certainly know that the budget for propaganda of Russia is around 4 billion. And that's why I have two questions. Could you briefly explain the main actions the East Stratcom division has taken since the 24th of February, this very important date? And I will join another question. Does East Stratcom have the resources that it needs to effectively counter disinformation related to the Russian invasion? What more does it need? We know the budget of Stratcom, and it's certainly not 4 billion. As MEPs, what three things we can do to make your work more effective? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. Over to Lutz.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to see Sandra, and thank you very much for the invitation. I will really keep it short. You said congressional hearing, so question, answer, without long explanations and setting, etc. So straight to the answer. And actually, Sandra, this answer to your question could be relatively long because we have done a lot, and not only since the 24th of February, start of this horrible war, but already in the run-up. And I would summarize it in a couple of points, and I'm happy to go deeper if there is a lot of interest. Number one of our activity is the awareness raising of how this disinformation is functioning from the Russian authorities, from the Russian state, from the Russian security apparatus and its proxies, how the ecosystem is functioning, to always put light into the dark of the tactics, of the techniques, of the procedures, to make people aware of the risk that is out there. Because I still feel, and I think you made this point also very, very clearly in your report of the INGI committee, knowing about these risks, knowing about these tactics, knowing about these activities is one of the best instruments that we have against them, so that people know where to open their eyes and where to look very, very carefully. And that, of course, this awareness raising, this exposure is, of course, done very publicly. And I think we have a unique structure here in the External Action Service with the EU versus Disinfo project. I think most of you, if not all of you, are reading what we are publishing there. This is carefully researched, carefully worked on. It is not only that we believe that only you or that we reach the entire European population with this, but we know that we want to also arm our own, how can I put it, our own multipliers, that we want to give NGOs, that we want to give civil society organizations, researchers, also the tools and the facts and figures and the direction in the hand. That's why EU versus Info is so important, also the work that we are doing. We have, of course, and now I get a bit ethnographic, worked with the Ukrainian colleagues also. We continue to work with them on supporting them. And you know that a lot of the structural issues that I don't want to claim that we have, we are to praise, it's really the Ukrainian side to praise for its very effective and very impressive communication structures and approaches. But we have also invested over the past 10, 12 years and continue to do so. We have worked not only on our own, excuse me, not only on our own communication, but also in supporting third parties, communicating about the war, about who is the aggressor, about what is happening. We have given those people who have been shut out, in particular in Russia, journalists, many other people, we have given them a platform also to speak. We are, of course, and now I come to the territory that will be more covered by my colleagues in a moment, but we have engaged very, very closely with the platforms, not only in the framework of the DSA or future DSA and code of practice that I'm sure also colleagues will speak about, but also in exchanging. So I see here the colleagues from Meta, for example, with our colleagues, we are in constant discussion also, giving them hints what we see, discussing what are good ways to stop these activities. And I would like to stop with the last element, and that is, of course, also our additional instruments that we have, in particular on the CFSP side, sanctions. I think these sanctions, and I really have to underline, it's not a ban, it is not censorship. These are sanctions against RT and Sputnik based on a very clear legal basis and in a good kind of relation, in a good balance between safeguarding the freedom of expression on the one hand, but sanctioning instruments of Russian state activities. We have done this, of course, that you all know. I don't want to go into much more details because otherwise I would be speaking, and I want to spare you that. Obviously, I'm happy to expand further, but on awareness raising, on resilience building, on capacity building, and this disruption, and the fifth area is the CFSP or kind of foreign policy related actions. We have been extremely active and actually already a little bit tired because we have been working relentlessly. What else can you do for us? And I keep it short. Eva, you want to keep this short? Well, it's not my birthday today, so I cannot. I would say everything that you wrote in your Inge report, that you're ready to consider, would be tremendous help for us. And maybe the one point of action that we need to think about in the institutional setup is we are working here in the External Action Service very, very closely with the Commission colleagues, but we need to think also about structures that will make this work sustainable. And I think there's one idea in your report that we should consider very carefully. It's maybe the idea of establishing a European Center for Information Integrity. So to give access to this type of data, to this insight, to what is happening, to the threat analysis, to a much broader group of people, including the many journalists that we brief here every day on this risk. I hope I have not been too long, Eva. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Look, just a little bit longer, but maybe you would keep it more brief for the next answers. Before I turn to our next online colleague, Vladimir Bilčík, who's our EPP coordinator in the Special Committee on Foreign Interference and Disinformation, I just want to welcome the other colleagues that are here in the room. First Vice President of the European Parliament, Othmar Karas, our EPP Vice President, Rasa, Michael Galler, who's our coordinator in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and hopefully you'll be able to stay with us for the panel too, and help me with the congressional, so to say, hearing, Lena Dupont, and of course, Prime Minister Kubilius as well. So thank you for joining us, but now over to Vladimir Bilčík, who's joining us online as he has a question to Lutz.
Thank you very much, Eva, and greetings to everyone. I think it's extremely timely we have this hearing, and it's wonderful to see Lutz Güllner, with whom we've had excellent cooperation in the context of our Special Committee on Disinformation. And I do hope we can continue to work on the implementation on the Kalniete report. I think that's the key. Now, to my question, I think we all understand that Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine has been a game changer in so many ways, and we do hope it's going to be a game changer also in the way we fight against disinformation. But my question is more on the positive note. Ukraine has been seen as a country which has really had a strong communication game in this war. What lessons can we learn in the EU from the Ukrainians here? Because I think they are already showing the world how to do it the right way. President Zelensky embodies it, but I think the whole of Ukraine really has done a splendid job when it comes to strong communication. And what can we learn in the EU to be also on the upside here? Thank you.
Thank you, Lutz. Over to you.
Good. Now I keep it a little bit shorter because I could do a long eloge of what the Ukrainian colleagues have done. But of course, we need to be very careful that we cannot compare everything. It's a unitary state. It's a clear structure. It's a president who's very, very clearly kind of communicating on behalf of his people. European Union is, of course, a slightly different animal in its structures, etc. But I would pick out two elements. The first one is authentic communications. And this is something that is not easy, obviously, for an institution like ours or the EU as a whole, but this needs to be a little bit more personal. It needs to be a little bit more direct as well. And that is something that is easier said than done. The second point, I think, is also the power of the image. I think we are working on this. We have, I think, made good progress, even in what my own team is producing, you know, with more modern forms, GIFs, whatever, you know, all sorts of things, videos of all in all forms and shapes. But these more kind of new elements, I think, is key. I hope that was not too much of a platitude, but it's really inspiring, huh? The elements that have been used by the Ukrainian side.
Thank you. I think we have all seen that and understood how effective communication works and can be effective. In fact, now over to David Lega, our colleague from the Foreign Affairs Committee, who's joining us, I believe, from Sweden today, and he's also a member of the EU-Russia Parliamentary Cooperation Group. David.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Mr. Gullner, for joining us today in this very important summit. My colleagues have already asked many relevant questions, but so I would like to ask, with the recent elections that we have seen, especially of those in Hungary and France, have you seen any examples of foreign interference and disinformation that could have affected the outcome of those elections? Or was the disinformation mostly coming from domestic sources? Thank you.
Lutz.
Well, we have seen in the past, as you said yourself, that there were very clear strategies behind. You know that my team does not have a mandate to investigate elections as such. We need to work very closely with our colleagues in the EU member states on this. A lot of member states, including yours, have set up new structures also on this. New agencies have been formed exactly to tackle this issue. What we are seeing, what we continue to see is that disinformation is not only about setting certain narratives, it's not about spreading a certain worldview, but it's a coordinated way of information manipulation that is very often combined with other instruments, sometimes in the cyber field, sometimes in other areas that has been so clearly set out by the Kalniete report. So we expect and we believe that we need to keep a very close eye on how this disinformation, or I prefer the word information manipulation at large activities, are targeted also at elections. I don't believe that elections can easily be turned by these activities. So you cannot change 15% or 20%, especially in stable democracies. But I see in particular the medium to long-term effect of these activities, this undermining of stability, the erosion of trust in state institutions and practices. I think this is something we need to be very, very vigilant for all elections, especially in the European Union.
Thank you. In fact, I think that's most worrying, this long-term effect over institutions. Lena is here with us. She's our vice coordinator in the LIBE committee, and that's going to be the last question for Lutz, as we are already, I think, slightly behind schedule. Lena.
So I just shortly echo my colleagues in thanking you, Eva, for organizing this important event in a very timely manner, and just then shortly turn to my question. Which, especially when we look at the medium and long-term effects that you both had touched upon, and given that the challenges are changing steadily and quite fastly, especially as of today, what more do you believe needs to be done to fight disinformation, and how can we better facilitate the cooperation between the respective actors and between those working to combat disinformation? Thanks.
Thank you, Lutz.
This question would require a very long answer, but I keep it very short. I could put it a little bit colloquial and say, please implement the Cañete report, because that will help us already. No, the real issue is that there will be not one measure that will help us in this. We need to think about a lot of measures at the same time. And they will come from awareness raising activities. There will be in the resilience building activities, capacity buildings activities. There will be in better regulation, that we are currently discussing. There will be in the better use of these instruments that we have. So for me, this is really core, that we do not just think about one silver bullet that will solve all the issues. We need to think in very different policy areas, and that will bring together very different colleagues and very different committees also of you. It is a foreign and security policy, but at the same time, to respond to it, you also need education policy, you need digital policy, you need so many different areas, and that makes it so difficult, because to piece all these elements together is key. But the one thing that I would like to underline is we need to support those civil society actors more that are engaged in the fight against disinformation. The many fact checkers, the many researchers, the many civil society initiatives in this field, be it for media literacy or be it for other areas, they deserve more support from us, rather than that we believe everything can be done from a government perspective. It's also here easier said than done, but I think this is something you should also as parliamentarians look very carefully at, and in addition, of course, to the structural issues that I mentioned beforehand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lutz. That was very informative and very concrete. In fact, if you would have been the last speaker of this panel, it would have very nicely merged to the second panel, as this is where most of those topics will be discussing with our speakers. But we move to the second speaker today, and I'm very happy to welcome here in person Alexander Alaphilippi, who's the Executive Director of the EU Disinformation Disinfolab. As it's phrased concretely. You operate here from Brussels, actually. We're happy you're among us. We move directly into, again, the Q&A. Hopefully this interactive format makes it not just more a bit different than usual events, but also it gives more answers to the questions we are seeking. And we go to Vlado Bilcik as the first person to ask a question.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased we have the Executive Director of the EU Disinfolab here with us. They do a lot of important work. My question is very short and very simple. The online platforms have created their own truth for people who are online, and they have magnified this in the different echo chambers as people have these very segmented spaces in which they operate online. My question too is, how bad is this for democracy in Europe?
Thank you, MEP Bilcik, and thank you, MEP Meidel and the EPP Group for inviting us. I'll keep it short. I think we only look sometimes at social platforms as the only source. I think for the past 25 years, we had a whole disruption of the distribution and the architecture of distribution of information online, which means that we had social platforms reinventing how we share information, how malicious actors and legitimate actors also can share information. Advertisement has been heavily disrupted by this revolution. Payments and online payments, crowdfunding, cryptocurrency are also new ways of funding the information outlets. And we have just in front of us a huge question, which would be what the metaverse look like. So I think we're all witnessing that the fundamental architecture that we've been building our regulation for the past 50 years has been completely disrupted in the past 20 years. So now the question is, with all the enforcing consequences that happen to that, what is a regulation that we can put forward that can have an impact both at citizens but also at accountability level? We need to end up the black box that has been created by algorithms, by opaque decision-making by these private actors, but we also need to have more rights, and I think the DSA is opening a new era for this.
Thank you. That was so concrete and up to the point. David Lega also has a question for you, Alexander. So, David.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Alaphilippe, for joining us as well. My question is more about freedom of expression. It's a very important, always an important subject, but especially the last weeks in Sweden, we had a lot of debate about it. So my question is, how do we protect and safeguard freedom of expression while we continue to identify and shut down Russian troll farms? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the question is a balance that we have between freedom of expression for citizens online, but also freedom to have access to information online. And I think that's a fundamental right also that in the Charter of the Fundamental Rights, we also need as a citizen to make sure that we have access to information and we are not polluted by disinformation and by malicious actors online. So the balance that we need to find is to have a balance between the capacity for everybody to express themselves online and offline, but also to have access as citizens to reliable information that has been curated and to know how this information has been curated. The Digital Services Act is bringing great solutions for that, especially Article 17 about what has been called and labeled the whether or not, is actually to ask the platforms why content has been moderated, which is a very important issue right now. We've seen at the beginning of the Ukraine war that fact checkers have been moderated by platforms because of automated decision-making by algorithms. So they need to understand why their content deleted, why their content suppressed, what was the basis and the reason for that. But at the same time, when disinformation is flagged, when disinformation is against the policies of the platform that they claim on a daily basis to fight, and they take specific policies to fight disinformation, we need to understand when this is flagged, how come that this disinformation cannot be removed? On what basis a platform took the decision to keep disinformation online? And that's why we need to have a balance of this right. And I think the DSA is actually providing a very good balance to have both freedom of expression being guaranteed and to have the grounds and the legal grounds to challenge content decision making, but also to challenge the absence of actions. Inaction is a choice. And thanks to the DSA, we hope that civil society and regular users will have more capacity to act and to have this balance of right.
Thank you very much for emphasizing on the need for moderation content. Vlado, I think you have two more questions, but maybe we fit Lena in between. So now over to you again.
Thank you very much. And I will actually pick up on this content moderation. I think this is an important issue and one that touches on the crux of what we need to do when it comes to what I would call meaningful regulation. But my question would be, generally, what do you see as the biggest challenge when it comes to content moderation? And what would improve speed and quality of content moderation? And in terms of the issue you've already touched on, that's the transparency and the general access to understanding why certain decisions are made. What do we lack here? I mean, what do we need to really have a trust in the social platforms that they actually do what they tell us to do, what we expect them to do when it comes to content moderation? Thank you.
Thank you. I think the biggest challenge we have right now, especially in Brussels and between policymakers and institutions, is to understand that transparency for the sake of transparency doesn't bring accountability. What we need to have is transparency that can be used to hold accountable who are the people that are behind the spread of disinformation. Right now, we need to know if we see disinformation online, who do we need to sanction? Do we need to sanction the actors that produce disinformation? Do we need to sanction the algorithm that put this content at a very high level of virality? Do we need to put into sanction the payment system that allow this content to be advertised and amplified? So the question here is not to have, I think it's important to have data and to have access to data. And we've been pushing for this with civil society to have access to data because platforms have not been reliable in access to data. But what is more important is how we will use this data, how we will use this transparency to have accountability. I can tell you examples of transparency and investigations. EU Disinfo Lab has released a number of investigations showing how media outlets links to a company called Inforos in Russia with contract with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. These assets have not been sanctioned in Europe. They've been sanctioned in the US by the US Treasury based on notably oil investigation and other work, but these outlets are still available in Europe. We have seen how other foreign countries, such as India, have been also using unlegitimate think tanks and empty shells in Brussels to do their lobbying. They have not been sanctioned. So the question that we need to put now is how much do we want to put accountability forward? If it's to only have more transparency and saying, oh, it's online, so we know about it, it's not enough. We need to have a policy to sanction and to have and to hold accountable who should be sanctioned, whether it's the malicious actors itself or the distribution architecture that I was mentioning before that has an impact into amplifying and distributing these contents to millions and hundreds of millions of Europeans.
Thank you. That was very clear. And now over to Lena.
Thanks, and thanks also for your important work and what you told us already about it. I think I can pick up a bit of the question that my colleague Vlad Bilčík had also already asked and look a bit into the future. So what do you believe will be the next trends and tools, especially tools in the spread of disinformation, so that we can be, let's say, a bit better prepared than we were probably by now or in the past? Thanks.
Thank you. I think what we've seen, and I'm also talking under the control of the many civil society organizations that are doing this work, because this threat is evolving at a very fast pace, and looking in the future is not looking behind. So basically, trying to find my crystal ball sometimes, which is always complicated. What we've seen, for instance, in the context of the Ukraine war, is the rise of this false equivalence narrative. And when you see Russia setting up websites called War on Fakes, mixing fact-checking and disinformation, when you see the false equivalence between qualifying Russia Today and BBC as the same type of media outlets, we've seen this as one of the biggest trends that is coming, that is trying to put a false equivalence on every content that we have. So that's why we need to have more transparency. And I think the other challenge that we will have is to have a robust way to explain how we hold accountable, because the narrative of censorship is very strong and it is a risk, but we need, thanks to the legislation that we have and thanks to the empowerment of civil society, again, the DSA will be a useful tool, and the European Media Freedom Act, etc., will be useful tools only if we have empowerment of civil society to use these and to make sure that we have results and impact and we can report on that.
Thank you. And we'll wrap up with a last question from Vlad Bilčík. I think this almost puts her in time, not really. But
thank you very much. And I will be very direct because I want to push you a little more on this issue of public accountability of private decisions. This is the crux of the matter. And my question is, we've had a number of measures in the pipeline. Of course, we just had a deal on the Digital Services Act. Is this a game changer, in your view, when it comes to public accountability? Or do you see a potential game changer in the legislation which is in the pipeline already? Or do we need to invent something new? How much could change from the standpoint of the much needed public accountability with the legislation which is already in place or soon to be in place? Thank you.
Thank you. The DSA is definitely a game changer. I would just take one example. Right now we had, and we're not the only one, like many civil society organizations have been experiencing this, that sometimes at the platforms and very often, unfortunately, it seems the reply button on Outlook is stuck. So you send an email, but you never got a reply on what has been done, what has been implemented, what are the policies involved, etc. So we feel that the DSA is going to put an end to this by forcing platforms to respond. And that's already a game changer on that, because we're actually ending up the black box of content decision making. We're ending up the blacklist. We're ending up the whitelist. We're ending up the ideas of having exemptions for sectors. We are putting everybody on the same level and to have accountability. So the DSA will be a crucial tool for that. It will, if it's used and if it's, again, I insist on that, if it's empowered, it's a powerful tool to provide accountability. Then it will be also up to digital service coordinators, to the EU institutions to make sure that we do not have only reporting on risk assessment, but we have a sanction policy for malicious actors and for the architecture distributing disinformation. We need to have both. If it's only to pile up papers and reports on the desk of MEPs, the Commission and the Council and digital service coordinators, it will not help. Pile of papers never solved disinformation in the past. It will not in the future. So the question is right now, the ball is in the camp of taking decisions and taking sanctions towards this architecture and the malicious actors.
Thank you very much. I think you had a number of very clear messages. A number of them resonated directly with what I've been advocating. And one is regarding transparency. That doesn't necessarily bring accountability, because I've had a lot of colleagues. We had some, intense discussions on, oh, we need more transparency, but for what? How are we going to use it? And I think also it's a nice way to move to the next speakers, as they're part of the equation that you were talking about. And for this reason, we have invited representatives of two online platforms to join us today, Meta and Twitter. And we go first to Aura Sala, who's the Director for Public Policy and Head of EU Affairs at Meta. Welcome, Aura. And the first question to you will be again from Vlado Bilcing, our special coordinator as well, we could say, because I'm a coordinator in the AI committee. In a way, we are special because we are just for a certain period of time, but in the special committee on disinformation. Vlado, please.
Thank you very much, and very good to see you, Ms. Sala, and very pleased to have a chance to ask a question. I want to continue in this dialogue on the public accountability. Because in the past, Facebook has created a war room for major events such as the US presidential elections. And I have heard a lot of frustration from even governmental officials from different member states now that we are facing Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine. So my question is, have you created a similar war room for Ukraine? And if not, why not? And if so, are you using it to the fullest potential also to really follow up on due process in any questions that arise, particularly with respect to an effective fight against disinformation? Thank you.
Thank you, Vlado, and welcome. Vlado, and welcome, Aura. Please, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
And many thanks, honorable members, dear Eva, for inviting Meta to this EPP Summit. This is really timely, and it's a good way of course, for us also to address what we are doing right now. Let me start by saying that all of us at Meta have been focusing on the war in Ukraine 24/7 in last couple of months, as many of you also. Our teams are really working around the clock to do our part to respond to Russia's unthinkable act of aggression. Coming from Finland myself, this is something that goes really deeply under my skin. Like I know that many of you share this feeling. It is an unprecedented moment for Europe, for the world, and also for platforms like ours. And we are fully aware what kind of a responsibility we have in this kind of a situation. And that is why we have been evolving our approach as the situation on the ground changes. We are working very closely, like Lutz mentioned already, with the European Commission, because we believe that we need this kind of a cooperation, what we have here also this evening, together with the European Parliament and European institutions, as well as European governments. Our first priority is really to ensure people using our services can do so safely and securely. To facilitate that, we've added several safety features in Ukraine and Russia, including the ability for people to lock their Facebook profile, removing the ability to view and search, for example, friends lists, and also additional tools on Messenger, because we know how many people are using also Messenger services in Ukraine and in surrounding areas. We've also focused on keeping our services, of course, up, because we strongly believe that they can be a vital tool for information and expression for people affected by this war. And indeed, thank you for this very important question. We have established a special operations center staffed by experts from across the company, including native Russian and Ukrainian speakers, allowing us to respond to issues in real time. And as I said, we are addressing these issues in daily basis, minute by minute, because we fully understand our responsibility here.
Thank you very much. Michael Galler, as I said, is with us today, our coordinator in the Foreign Affairs Committee. Michael, you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much. There has been concern that platforms are removing evidence of war crimes, as some of the images that are posted by people violate your terms. Now, I understand that on the one hand, but on the other hand, potentially this is lost evidence if it is simply removed. And the question is there any way you could, on the one hand, remove it, but stock it or keep it for the use, for instance, by if it comes to war crime tribunal or the International Criminal Court, because such evidence is, I think, first-hand evidence is really essential. Yeah, what are you doing with these things that you remove? Do you stock it?
Thank you. Thank you. This is an excellent question, and of course, this is not only about Ukraine. As we know, in the world, we have many crises, ongoing wars. So that's why this is a very important question overall. As we said in our community standards, we allow people to share graphic and violent content to raise awareness of important issues, such as human rights abuses. We will only remove this type of content when it glorifies the violence or celebrates the suffering of others, or when the content is extremely graphic or violent, for example, video footage of dismemberment. In relation specifically to the war in Ukraine, we are exploring ways of preserve this type and other types of content. When we remove it, in case it continues, it constitutes as evidence of violations of international humanitarian law. So to answer to your question, yes, we are exploring these ways, how we can do that, and right way also according to the international law.
Thank you very much. I also have a question, and there's been a lot of buzz around the metaverse lately. And I think it could be an interesting way of how to facilitate democracy. But how do we prevent it from also facilitating autocrats, dictators, in this respect, disinformation as well? Can the metaverse perhaps learn from the establishment of the original product of Meta, that was Facebook? Are there discussions within the company in that respect? Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. This is a great question. And I would like to say this to this room and also the audience who is listening to this, who are listening this evening. We want to get this right with metaverse, what comes to regulation. We are not a teenager anymore in this company. I think we are 18 years, 19 years old already. And we have learned our lessons in many ways also, that I can say that we want to build the regulation around metaverse together with you, policymakers, right from the start. So that's why it's super important to raise awareness how metaverse actually works now and how it most likely will work in 5 to 10 years time, for example. We fully understand that self-regulatory initiatives are not enough. They were never enough. And we believe that private companies should not be making these kind of important decisions as we have been making for years. And we have been repeating this line, I think, many times also in this room. Content regulation is important to ensure companies are making decisions about online speeds in a way that it minimizes harm, but also respects fundamental right and more broadly than free expression, as we have said for years with Facebook, Instagram. But now when we talk about metaverse, it's a broader thing, and that's why we need to work there together. But also in this vein, we welcome the recent agreement on the DSA, because it shows us the way we can actually do these things together and find ways for companies like us to make sure that the safety, privacy, how we handle data, all these things are taken care of, so to say, now when we move to also one day maybe regulate metaverse.
Thank you very much. Not sure Alexander is in agreement, but we are on hours time now. Alexander, we could comment after the event. Lega, David, has a question as well. David, over to you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Ms. Sala, for joining us in very, very important discussion. My question is about media literacy. Do you think that Meta should do more to educate people in media literacy and ensure that they do not assume that everything they see and read on social media is a fact or the truth? And if so, what should you do? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great question again, where I think that, okay, we are already working hand in hand with regulators and policymakers, NGOs, different organizations, and we are actually spending a lot of capacities to doing trainings and also teaming up with different organizations around the globe on media literacy and digital literacy. So definitely we are spending a lot of time there. However, I don't think this is enough, and that's why we needed, for example, this regulation what comes to the DSA. And let me assure you that the safety of our users is our primary concern, and all our policies are geared towards it while balancing people's freedom of speech, because we actually want people to spend time on our platforms. We want people to enjoy spending time on our platforms. And I can assure you, like many of us in this company are assuring people in these type of events, no one wants to see hate speech on our platforms. Our users doesn't want to see it. Our advertisers doesn't want to see it. So we are working on that, no matter if there is regulation, even though now there is also robust regulation what comes to this. So what we are doing also is that we make sure that there is a news feed for news organizations like BBC or CNN, Reuters, that people can see these kind of facts and quality journalism when they go to our platforms. You can label your page that it's actually your page, or it is a news page. So there are different ways that we can inform people where the news sources come from, or are they based on some facts or not. But also, of course, for us, it is super important that people can still express their opinions freely on our platforms. And that's where media literacy, digital literacy, it is so important. So people know how to read posts of their friends and family, and also from some propaganda pages, or people who wants to still spread some misleading information on our platforms. So media literacy, digital literacy, I would put those in the center of also strengthening the resilience of our societies.
Thank you very much. And last question, because we're going to move to our next guest, and it's again a platform, as I mentioned, Nick Pickles from Twitter. But before that, first question was oriented about did you create a similar type of war room like you did for the US presidential election? And I believe in this sort of environment, there has to be collaboration. So I would like to know whether you collaborate with other platforms or other people and actors or establishments such as news guards, similar bodies in tackling disinformation.
Yeah, in addition to removing violating content and accounts that, let's say, repeatedly violate our rules, we have implemented similar changes to our peers to reduce the reach of Russian state accounts. So yes, to answer to your question, we are adapting and evolving our community standards and our response to this situation in Ukraine constantly, and we are working in very close cooperation with different organizations, but also we are taking this stance when it comes to our peers.
Thank you very much, Aura and Meta, for joining us today. We are starting to be slightly short on time, but we'll now swiftly move to Nick Prickles, who's Senior Director, Global Public Policy Strategy, Development and Partnership at Twitter. Welcome, Nick, and your first question comes from Lena Dupont. Please, Lena.
Thanks, Eva, and I think it's a very good question to start with. So the question will directly be, can you explain what actions you have taken since the 21st of February to fight disinformation spread by Kremlin and Putin supporters? I think it's a very good start for your input. Thanks.
Well, thank you for raising this, and thank you, MEP Mayardel, for bringing us together to discuss this at an incredibly important time for the world. Firstly, the work in this area actually began back in 2017, when we stopped Russia Today and Sputnik from using Twitter's advertising products. And then in 2019, when we banned all state media from any country around the world from using our advertising products. And then in 2020, banned political advertising. And so when it came to the current crisis and the invasion of Ukraine, we already had taken steps, and then we've built on them. So we've suspended more than 100,000 accounts for suspected platform manipulation, for example. We have reduced the visibility of Russian government accounts, and we've also complied with the European Union sanctions to limit the access to state media within Europe. Something else I think is also very important, we're working to protect the people who are using Twitter to get critical information out to the world, be that humanitarian advice, civilian journalism, and information about the atrocities being committed there. And that's through account security advice and making sure that people's accounts are properly secure. So a whole range of actions. And as we've been hearing from previous speakers, certainly not something that we are resting on, and we continue to investigate opportunities to strengthen our work.
Thank you very much, Nick. My question touches upon on what you've mentioned regarding banning political advertisement. I was just wondering whether you saw any changes in how foreign malign actors behave after this action has been taken by Twitter?
Well, I think every space we work in, be it political advertising, be it platform manipulation, is adversarial. So every time we do anything, we should expect bad actors change their behavior. In the case of political advertising, I think it's more likely that when Twitter took that decision, they may have looked for other avenues for funding. We have definitely seen, and Alexander touched on this earlier, the emergence of disinformation as a service. So commercial companies who will sell things that may be engaged through support. So there's a range of activities. We've strengthened our policies, for example, if information is hacked and leaked onto the service. State media certainly became a more prominent part of some states' responses to information operations. And even then, when we changed our policy on state media, they changed their activities. So it was less about the brand and more about the individuals, the editors, the on-screen journalists. So we've constantly have to keep looking at that behavior change to make sure our approach is robust and tackling the challenges that we see today.
Thank you. David Lega has a question for you as well. David.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Mr. Pickles, for joining us today. And my question is in the same area, but more specific maybe. I mean, you decided to remove Donald Trump from your platform after the insurrection on January 6th, but you continue to allow the Russian leadership to keep their Twitter pages. So I'm curious to hear more about that assessment and how you make that. Thank you.
Well, this is a question we have heard before, and the direct answer is that any account that breaks the Twitter rules, we will take action on. For repeated violations and severe violations, we will suspend those accounts. For other situations, we may apply a label, we may give the account a timeout. And so we have taken action on a number of Russian government accounts that have involved content removal, that has involved timeouts. And if any Russian government account, or indeed any government account from anywhere in the world, repeatedly and severely breaks our rules, we will always consider permanent suspension as a potential remedy.
Thank you. I actually had a similar question in the beginning of the war, because I noticed a number of times of some of Russian leadership accounts and institutions spreading false information. But thanks for your answer. But in this respect, it isn't possible to actually report disinformation on your platform. I wanted to ask you, why is this the case? And is this something you are planning to change? Is it something that it's been discussed in Twitter, or that's how the policy will remain to be? And if you drew some lessons from the COVID crisis, because there was a array of disinformation campaigns in that arena as well. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for raising this question, because I think user reporting, I've been at Twitter nearly 8 years, and user reporting has been something that has always been the if you like, the first step. And actually, with misinformation, we are currently piloting in a number of countries, including Brazil, which has a large election later this year, different ways of allowing people to flag content to us that may violate our rules, without necessarily following the same model that we've had previously, where every user can report a unique piece of content, because that means duplication. It means people report things they disagree with. So you have a lot of reports coming in that aren't always accurate. And so we are experimenting with different models that allow us to identify violations quicker, without necessarily having a system where every single report has to be reviewed by a human. And that's evolving technology, but we are certainly finding in these experiments that by using machine learning and humans, and this is, I think, has come up a few times, collaboration with partners, with governments, we're able to move quicker on violating content. And that's something that's optimistic. And I think probably one of the biggest lessons from COVID, number one, the advice changes, the facts are evolving. And I think it's an important lesson to remember that very rarely are we dealing in a situation where the truth is absolute. There's often a grain of truth problem, as some researchers call it. So having a range of interventions, we can apply a label, we can recommend people look at an authoritative website from a health agency, rather than jumping straight to content removal. I think COVID has borne out that that's been an important development in content moderation, and that there will always be debate, and we as a platform should be a place for that debate, and we should protect and encourage it.
Thank you very much. There's one more last question for you from Lena. Lena, the floor is yours.
Thanks, and somehow also a question then that somehow wraps up and builds upon those things that you just mentioned. So what do you see as a main challenge of the future for social media? Do you see the development of social media as a dystopian or utopian, and what needs to be done in order to have a positive outcome and not the negative one?
Thank you, and I think perhaps my Yorkshire roots, I'm going to go neither option. I suspect we'll have some positives and some negatives, because that's a reflection of the society that we live in and the challenges that we face. I think what gives me optimism is we've heard about, for example, investment in digital literacy, and that's being, I think, prioritized. We've had a partnership with UNESCO for many years. We've produced resources for teachers and educators to build those materials. Critical thinking is an important part of this, but so is tackling not just social media. And I think one of the lessons of the DSA debate is there are more than 4 companies on the internet. And sometimes when we're thinking about this, there are a whole range of services used by small numbers of people, used by very politically aligned groups of people, or indeed groups of people who might say they were not politically interested at all, who are sharing information, amplifying others. And so that whole of society response, I think, is absolutely critical. And to build that whole of society response, we have to make sure that, that there's only 2 companies here today, and we need to make sure there's a very wide range of services involved, but also that we're asking questions about the role of traditional media, the role of political advertising, the role of political funding and financing, there's a whole range of ways that people can exert influence on the political debate, and social media is just one part of that equation.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was very concrete. We look forward to visiting you soon out in California, perhaps. Thanks for joining us, and you're very welcome to stay for our next panel, because we have an excellent line of speakers, because we would like to continue the discussion into topics such as facts, free speech, media literacy, and resilience. And for that reason, I'm very happy and excited to welcome Michael Chertoff to open this session with a short keynote. Secretary Chertoff served as the second U.S. Homeland Security Secretary, and in 2018, he co-founded the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity alongside former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen and Joe Biden. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for joining us. And now over to you for some opening remarks in your speech.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chertoff, we can't hear you. Can you please press the speak button?
Classic mistake of failing to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
We hear you very well, and we can see you. Thank you.
Very good. I'm delighted to participate in this. I think right now the issue of disinformation is very much front and center. Let me step back for a moment, though, and say that in a way, disinformation has been with us for a long time. If you go back at least 100 years, maybe longer, we used to call it propaganda. And interestingly, if you look at the old Soviet Union, an important part of their strategy was to use the Comintern as a way of propagating false stories about democracy and the West, because they saw that as advancing in the world. So disinformation is not new, but what I will say in a moment is that what has changed is the platform in which disinformation takes place, and that has dramatically increased the impact. I would also say that what's very clear now, and you see this particularly with respect to Russia and China, is that disinformation is now viewed as a critical element of the strategy for geopolitical rivalry and even geopolitical conflict. The expression sometimes used is that disinformation has become weaponized. It's become a way of undermining your adversary, which then gives you a distinct military and strategic advantage. In many ways, what we're seeing with the disinformation that has been highlighted over the last 5 to 10 years, notably, for example, in the election arena, where we saw it in 2016, we saw it in 2020, and we've seen it not only in the United States, but we've seen it in Europe. What this has been about is undermining the unity of the West and the faith that citizens of democracies have in their institutions. Because the adversaries of democracy understand that if people lose trust in institutions and they lose trust in the facts on which those institutions rely, then you really undermined their ability to engage in competition or rivalry, and they wind up essentially just turning inward on themselves. And so from a geopolitical standpoint, that has been a good deal of the agenda with respect to Russia and with respect to China and other autocratic states. As I said a moment ago, though, what has changed is not the motivation, because that's consistent with what we've seen for decades, but the platforms and the methods being used. The reality is, both with social media and the internet, and also, frankly, with the proliferation of mass media, the scale, frequency, and ubiquitousness of information is much, much greater than was the case, for example, 50 years ago. Particularly in the pandemic, what we saw is people are basically connected almost on a 24/7 basis with their device, which becomes their umbilical cord to what's going on in the world. And that means the ability to pursue a relentless policy of promoting disinformation becomes much easier, because instead of waiting for people to tune into the evening news once a day, the news follows them around, or what purports to be the news follows them around, and that makes it easier to weaponize. I have to say, given what's going on in Ukraine now, I think this phenomenon will only increase. As we see the West impose significant sanctions on Russia, one of the responses we may see will be the stepping up of disinformation, both to undermine the support for the sanctions, but also more generally to weaken democratic nations and force them to pay attention to disunion and dissension inside their own countries rather than what's going on in Ukraine. So I think we're only going to see the tempo of these disinformation campaigns increase. And you mentioned the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. We have been looking at disinformation as it relates to elections over the last 2 or 3 years, and there's no question that elections remain a major focus of disinformation campaigns from anti-democratic nations. So let me focus in, before I conclude, on 3 specific dimensions of disinformation that exploit some of the particular peculiar elements of social media platforms and more generally the internet. The first is, because the internet allows for people to masquerade as someone that they're not in many instances, the ability to obscure identity and to obscure who is financing the speaker or the message sender allows malign forces, whether they be criminal groups, terrorist groups, or nation states, to pretend to be domestic citizens of the country they're targeting. And that gives a credibility to the message that would not be true if the person tuned in, for example, and saw that it was Russia Today that was putting out the information, and they would immediately begin to wonder whether there was a motive to be biased. With obscuring identity, I think that becomes much harder, and that puts a major burden, and something which we might be requiring increasingly by regulation, a major burden on the platforms to unmask message senders who are pretending to be someone that they're not, and to force them to identify themselves and where they're coming from. I would add, in addition to that, what we often see is some of the platforms that exploit the internet to send messages, some of the groups, interest groups, are being secretly funded by nation states. And that suggests that another significant objective for regulation has to be to unmask hidden money and secret ownership. This is, of course, again, something very much in the news with the Russian oligarchs who have taken the money that they stole from Russia and have used it to embed themselves in a number of Western institutions that appear on the surface to be anodyne and benign, but are actually, at least to some degree, responding to the messages that the Kremlin wants sent out. So dealing with obscure identity and financing, I think, is one important element of a strategy to deal with disinformation. A second, maybe even more potent, is the issue of algorithms. What has really made some of the social media platforms particularly effective in communicating disinformation is that it is microscopically targeted to individual viewers based on data that has been collected about them that allows some kind of artificial intelligence to fashion a message that is likely to be particularly attractive in luring the particular viewer to go down, as we say, the rabbit hole, to continue to click on it and to continue to immerse themselves in it. This is playing on a combination of emotion and information about a person's interests that mean that the message sender no longer has to send a message with a broad appeal, but can literally tailor it to the individual viewer, which makes it much more potent and, again, much more credible. Requiring disclosure of algorithms and even limiting the use of algorithms as a way, for example, of liking or tweeting or propagating or resending messages is an important tool if we're going to reduce the effect of disinformation. You can't stop someone from being persuaded from something that's silly or wrong. But if that person can't automatically press a button and then send it to 10,000 friends, you've at least slowed them up a little bit in propagating the disinformation. So how these tools, the algorithms and the forwarding mechanisms work, again, become an important part in slowing the velocity of misinformation. Finally, we get to the question of dealing with content. And here's an area where I think the United States may be a little more cautious than Europe because of our First Amendment and our particular investment in freedom of speech. I think there are some speech that's clearly unprotected and can be taken down. Child pornography, incitement to violence, direct misinformation about things, for example, like where to get medicine. I mean, those would be something I think it'd be relatively easy to identify and shut down. But the truth is, if you look at many disinformation campaigns, it's not so much that they rely upon telling you that 2 + 2 is 5, but it's more that they propagate opinions and perspectives and conclusions, often actually domestically generated, but amplified by foreign powers. And they do it in a way that actually incites people to go along with what the message is. The problem is when you're dealing with opinions and conclusions, truth and falsity are a little ambiguous. If I say a particular political figure is motivated by, base motives, that's an opinion. How do I prove that that's absolutely false? I might think it's unsupported and unfounded, but can I actually prove it is literally untrue to the degree necessary to make it legally susceptible to being taken down? So I think as we deal with the issue of content, we need to be careful not to use too broad a brush. We need to remember sometimes the regulator who is deciding that content is, quote, fake news may be a person with a pernicious motive of his or her own. But then again, I think if we deal with the algorithms and the identity issues, we can certainly blunt the velocity and the scope and the scale of disinformation messages. So with that, I'm happy to answer a couple questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. That was very concrete and also insightful, and in a way, the perfect scene setter for the panel and discussions we are going to have. And thank you for your time once again. I think both me and Michał Galler here in the room have a short question for you, so we could also keep within the time. So I give the floor to Michał, and then I'll ask my question. Michał.
Yes, thank you very much. When we come to this issue of disinformation, for me the limit was the time before we had the internet and the time now. So before the internet, we also had democracies and dictatorships. In the old Soviet Union, the people there, then you were very much aware what was true and what was propaganda and what was likely or what was unlikely. And in our democracies before the internet, we also had people with crazy ideas, but at first they were alone with themselves. And it took quite some efforts for them to find other crazy guys who believed in the same things. So, and then they were amongst themselves. Now we have still democracies and dictatorships, but we have the internet and the social media. And unfortunately, on the dictatorial side, they have made full use of these technical possibilities and use everything. We see in Russia what an awful effect that has. And indeed, although people were very suspicious of the old communist time, now in this dictatorial new shape that they are facing, they apparently seem to believe what they are told. That is what we have. Then we have to conduct a discussion later how to react on that from our side. But in our open societies, and you rightly addressed the issues, how quickly it goes to spread wrong information. The 6th of January last year in the US was, of course, a wake-up call for us, and it showed how even mature democracies can be misled. And we in Europe also have to react within our societies. We have seen yesterday more than 40% for very right-wing candidate in France. I think it has also, on the one hand, to do with deficits in mainstream policy making. That is perhaps the case in the US as well. But on the other side, we have the situation of the speed with which disinformation can be spread. So should we not rather, instead of reacting on the effects, see to it that we do another policy in our countries to rebuild and restore the trust of our citizens in our political systems, and also then into reputable media sources. If I may, as a European, simply say, looking to the US, this diverse society, wouldn't it require more than 2 relevant parties? Do I have to decide whether Biden is right or Trump is right? I think that is a bit too little. And perhaps that should also be a discussion in regaining trust of the citizens, to give them a third or another alternative. But that is a humble European view. Thank you.
No, I have to say, I agree. I think that we have to, there are some deeper issues in society which are exploited with disinformation that have to do with economic uncertainty and inequality. Issues about past corruption that make people cynical, and concerns that large business enterprises and other influential elites have an overly dominant role in society. I think there are some systemic issues to be dealt with. I would also agree with another point that you make, which is it's not only about the internet and social media. I mean, to take an example, we still have a significant minority of Americans who believe the 2020 election was stolen. Now, that has been disproven in probably 50 courtrooms. They've never produced evidence of any significant corruption of the election. So why does that continue to be mouthed? It's not even the internet. It's Trump getting up and giving speeches, which the mainstream media reports. And one of the debates they're having now is, should they report all those speeches, or is that merely giving a platform to the same lie over and over again? So I think the issue of propaganda and lies, I agree, goes beyond the internet, although the internet has certainly made it easier for these falsehoods to take off.
Thank you very much. And just this short question from my side. I don't know if you're aware, but here in the European Parliament, we are working on a so-called AI Act. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts whether artificial intelligence has changed the nature of this information, particularly thinking here in the use of deepfakes, and how could we possibly combat that or tackle it as an issue? What are your views? Thank you.
I think artificial intelligence certainly does play a role. I mean, deepfakes is an issue that we've talked about on the Transatlantic Commission, and there are now people working on technical solutions that would enable you to identify a deepfake and to label it as such. But more generally, what artificial intelligence allows someone to do, either for good or for ill, is to analyze an enormous matter of individual data points and then integrate them together in a way to give a picture of what a particular individual thinks or is interested in or might be susceptible to. So although in the past, persuading people of things required understanding a little bit about their background or what they might be interested in, you couldn't do it at scale because you didn't have enough time. It had to be done on an individualized basis. Now you can do it for literally hundreds of thousands and millions of people. And I think we need to think about, again, not so much artificial intelligence per se as what use is being made of it and to what extent it is becoming a vehicle for transmitting data or for luring people in or for allowing things to move up the popularity scale so that something looks like it's widely appreciated, but that's really a myth. It's really based upon manipulation using artificial intelligence. So I think this is a very fair point on which to focus.
Thank you very much, Secretary Cherdov. It's been a pleasure to have you and to hear your thoughts and insights. We are moving to the line of speakers for this panel, and we'll continue staying in the United States. And I'm very happy to welcome Kelu Chao, the acting CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, but also a veteran voice of America journalists. It's an honor to have you, Ms. Chao, with us. You will be now mainly hearing questions from the room. We'll be kind of ping-ponging questions and answers together with Michael Galler here. So Michael, if you would like to go first into the Q&A, and then I'll follow with a second question.
Well, the first question is, how, in your mind, how could journalists navigate their role and ensure quality reporting in repressive media environments, including where independent journalism is censored and freedom of expression is restricted or punished? I mean, we have many examples in Europe, Turkey as one. I mean, we need not always go to Russia. We just learned that Osman Kavala was sentenced for life in a Turkish court. Now he's not particularly a journalist, but in a similar role, and that is a danger in this very country for many journalists. And the question, indeed, should you rather shut up or go in line with the official opinion, or risk your freedom? Three options that are not very attractive. So how do you look at that?
Ms. Chao, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. I want to take this opportunity to note that journalism is a sacred profession. It is an extremely difficult job these days, and especially in all of our colleagues in international broadcasting, because most of them work in the very difficult places. They understand the mission and the need to provide fact-based reporting, and yet they're willing to risk their safety, their freedom, and sometimes even their lives for this work. As you probably know, we have several reporters and contributors in places like Belarus, Russia, and Vietnam that are in jail or facing serious criminal charges just for doing their jobs. It is incumbent upon us to provide journalists with all the necessary tools and protections to support their ability to uncover the truth. I'm talking about trainings, special equipment, additional resources, secured communication, and information sharing tools. I'm also talking about opportunity to provide a third pair of eyes from their editors and provide additional sources, and so that their reporting can be enriched. I'm also talking about the need to provide them with support and backing to ensure their safety, whether it's moral support, knowing that we're always there for them, or political support when things do go wrong and they're arrested or sentenced, like our Belarusian contributor Ihar Losik, who's sentenced to 15 years in jail right now. I also want to acknowledge the important work of our colleagues at organizations such as Reporters Without Borders or CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists, and others. They help us navigate those issues, and therefore, our reporters in the field, and we were talking about especially reporting in repressive media environment, can be stronger and can provide more enhanced fact-based reporting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chow. I wanted to touch upon a little bit on part of the topic of the discussion on media literacy. It's something that it lies into some of the reports we produce, in many of the discussions that we have here in the European Parliament and in the institutions. But in your experience, what would be the most effective way we can engage with citizens to basically be able to see, information through facts and also through quality journalism. And in this respect, quality reporting needs resources to be produced, especially in the news cycle that we've been mentioning, how fast it goes over the discussion today. But we also are witnessing a world of increasing number of paywalls to access this quality journalism. So again, when it comes to encouraging citizens to look for this fact-based and quality journalism, how could we encourage them to diversify the news that they read, that they actively search or look for? I mean, it's in a way a very, I think, difficult question, and it's not necessarily for policymakers. There's various actors, and that's why we have summoned this summit today and have various panelists. But if you could share your thoughts and recommendations, will be very important. Thank you.
Thank you for this very extremely important questions. USAGM, the U.S. Agency for Global Media, is the main agent for all civilian U.S. international broadcasting. Our mission is to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom of and democracy. So I want to go back to we were talking about media literacy tools and how do we better engage citizens with fact-based quality journalism. I believe it is extremely important, essential for public service media like USAGM and others to provide high-quality journalism and produce programming that is not only objective, informative, but also encouraging active and engaged people's connection with people. What I'm talking about is that volume of this, the quantity of this, the quality of this is just a constant stream, moment by moment, time and again. Provide them the opportunity across all the platforms so that they have opportunity to see the fact, to understand the nuances surrounding the information, and to understand the explanation related to their work, their life, their region, and their country, as well as the relations with outside world. And so when information provide them this networks of a safety and security, because of they are empowered, they understand more about it instead of just easily swayed by the bad actors and disinformation efforts. I think the base is important. And how do we make it easier? We need to have this opportunity to get them be able to access us more easily, access us more frequently, and access on the multi-platform, wherever their preferred platform is, that we should be able to really concentrate on providing distributing information to them. And so I think it's upon us to really think about what will be the opportunity to make their life easier, to seek the information, and the information will be ready constantly, always at their fingertips, so that they will be stronger and in countering the misinformation surrounding them and when it happened.
Thank you very much. That was really concrete. Mikhail, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, you are working on these topics. We have our East Stratcom. There are many national governments who have installed similar bodies to check and alarm or people or to build up resilience. So for me, the question is, how can we better facilitate the cooperation between those attempting to combat disinformation? I'm the chairman of the Taiwan Friendship Group. I know that you have a Taiwanese background, and with the Taiwanese, we are also talking because they have a real experience how to combat Chinese propaganda and to build up resilience on the island. I think it's really good and worthwhile that such bodies would better cooperate. What is actually ongoing, or would you have suggestions how to establish or improve that?
Thank you. This is important questions because disinformation is very big. It's a multifaceted problems and no one can address it alone. Partnerships are key. Also, the news business has changed. Media technology have changed too. It's even more important now to collaborate and help each other. I want to give you one example. For over 20 years, USAGM, we have been a member of DG8, informal coalition among international public media organizations such as BBC, Deutsche Welle, and France Media Monde. These are independent broadcasters to provide fact-based objective journalism to more than 1 billion people, particularly in repressive countries. And we frequently share information, exchange research, best practices, and other insights, and that can help enhance our work. Last month, shortly after Russian invasion, DG8 held an emergency meeting and made a commitment to make sure that Ukrainian and Russian audiences have access to unbiased information as the war unfolds. A big part of our conversation is also involved supporting Ukrainian public service media organizations, our partners on the ground, and other journalists in Ukraine, Russia, and beyond. I'd like to also mention about another essential aspect of your question, which is close collaborations with partners on the ground, local partners, local journalists, local media. We cannot do our work if we don't collaborate closely with them. And we need their connections, their nuances of understanding about issues, their challenges they're facing, and their background. And so I encourage our journalists to go above and beyond our comfort zones, not just among ourselves, but also expand and extend our corporations and our collaboration with local journalists. And together, we are much stronger in combat disinformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chow, and thank you for joining us today. We have a very packed second panel, so I would like to thank you for your time and giving, in a way, the perspective from the United States. I think the leadership that we see from the US is indispensable for maintaining the rules-based global order. And I think having more than ever today a tight transatlantic partnership in every area is the basis that we can have to prosperous societies, to be honest. But we'll move now back to Europe, and I'm very happy and pleased to welcome Jamie Fly, the CEO and President of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, who's joining us today. Thank you for being with us. Both Michael Galler and I here from the room have a couple of questions for you, and in case my MEP colleagues online would like to chip in, please give us a sign and let us know. So perhaps, Michael, over to you, because I know you might have to leave soon.
Yes, thank you very much, Jamie Fly, for joining us here. Now, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has a huge record and a great record during the time of the Cold War, when you broadcast facts not only to the Soviet Union, but also to the other captive nations and also peoples inside the Soviet Union and out in the Warsaw Pact. And undoubtedly, you helped to overcome the Kremlin propaganda. But today, with so many Russian citizens taken in by the Putin narrative about Ukraine, what can we do to help show them the truth and show them what their soldiers are doing in their name? I have to say, I'm really shocked about all these reports from Russia when our journalists ask those people in the streets, and they are just repeating these lies. Is there any chance for us to counter that?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the very important question, which we are spending all of our time right now trying to answer on a daily basis as we guide our journalists and help support their work. What we're focused on right now is, despite the fact that Putin does have a stranglehold to a certain extent on Russian society, and despite the fact that he's blocking sources of independent news and information, we're seeing on a daily basis that there are Russians, millions of Russians, who are interested in getting access to the truth. They're coming to our reporting on a daily basis. They're coming to our reporting from the ground. The stories that we're able to show the Russian people from inside Ukraine, highlighting not just what's happening with the war or political developments in the Ukrainian government, but telling the stories of fellow Russians who were sent on an almost impossible mission in this war, a fantasy mission in some extent, chasing after neo-Nazis that don't exist. We're highlighting the stories of those soldiers, of them as they unfortunately are killed, of them as they're captured, the stories of their families back in Russia who are frustrated about the way that their sons or brothers have been treated. But we're also highlighting the stories of Ukrainian civilians who are caught up in this war, who have lost loved ones, and allowing them to talk to our journalists and then sharing those stories with Russians directly. We found that that sort of reporting resonates with Russians despite the information stranglehold that Putin is exerting on the Russian public. We've also been very clear that we're not censoring our information and our reporting. We refuse to censor, to keep our websites active. We've seen signs that our Russian audience respects us for that they understand that upholds our long tradition of providing independent news and information and providing the truth. We're also helping them circumvent the blocking, providing information about VPN usage, about mirror websites so they can access independent information. And as we're doing that, we're also looking beyond the immediate news and the interest in the war, which is there, but also making sure that they are provided with a broader set of news and information about things that are affecting their lives, the sanctions, the economic fallout, local issues that people still are very concerned about. And these are things that the Putin-sponsored state propaganda outlets have ignored for years. And so we're making sure that our reporting is not just about geopolitics, is not just about Ukraine, but about a full suite of issues that we're seeing average Russians still care about, even as we enter this new environment inside Russia.
Thank you very much. I just want to build on that, but a little bit in a different way. What we've noticed is that some of the disinformation that has been emerging from Russia, for my opinion, and for the opinion perhaps to people listening today or here in the room, has been so extreme that it's very hard to believe that it could find, some sort of credibility by people living in the Western societies. But I also come from a country where some of this information is actually perceived by some parts of society as credible. And I was just wondering whether you have noticed any sort of growing audience within the European Union and within Western societies for this Russia's manipulative narrative that has been even more intense today than before.
It's a very important question, and we operate outside of Russia across a number of countries in Central Europe, including in 3 EU member states, in Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. Those are newer services that we've launched within the last 3 years, and they were launched in part because we were concerned about growing disinformation propagated by Russian-backed outlets. I think our observations over the last month and a half of the war are mixed. I think across parts of the EU, we have not seen necessarily the sort of Russian disinformation campaigns you would expect. I think some of that, my personal assessment is because some of the chief propagandists were a bit surprised about Mr. Putin's decision to go to war, and so they perhaps were caught off guard and were a little bit late in terms of developing the narratives to support the war, certainly for an external audience. And then once they realized what was happening, they realized that they had a significant challenge at home to convince the domestic audience of the importance of this war, and a lot of their resources have been dedicated to that. Having said that, we've seen open reporting that the Kremlin has actually significantly increased its propaganda budget since the beginning of the war. And we've seen signs in some of the countries that we operate in, and I was just in Bulgaria several weeks ago, where Russian narratives are taking hold and are being spread, including by domestic actors online who are pushing some of the same conspiracy theories that we see come out of Kremlin outlets. And so I think it is a significant concern in certain EU member states. And we know that the Kremlin has a long history of trying to sow anti-EU narratives, including in EU member states. And it also often spreads disinformation about Ukraine, of questioning support for Ukraine, and also trying to divide the United States from its European allies. And so these are all themes that the Russian propaganda outlets have spread for many years. And now they're still trying to do the same. I know that the EU has blocked a number of the chief propaganda outlets like RT and Sputnik from operating in a number of EU countries, but we still see them spreading these concerning narratives using online tools on social media platforms, websites that are not tied to official news organizations. And we at RFERL have tried to respond by increasing the placement of our Russian language network, Current Time, across the EU, and we've been very pleased since the start of the war that we've signed, I believe, more than 50 new deals on European cable providers, satellite providers, to make sure that there is factual Russian language reporting available in markets where RT and Sputnik are no longer available.
Thank you very much for this answer. I was just wondering, I mean, even if we make sure there is an increased access to facts and free media, do you think that could actually change the perception, the hearts and minds, so to say, of Russian Putin supporters in a relatively short space of time? My worry is that it could take years, it could take a generational change to challenge this pre-existing biases, because at least least to some of those people that would believe that propaganda, when I've talked to them, it kind of strikes me as something that they've inherited from their parents' generation beliefs. So how do you see that developing in the months and years to come?
So we, by nature, at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, are optimists, and I think there's great cause for pessimism right now because of what we've seen. And one of your colleagues mentioned the street interviews, which we're still doing on the streets of Moscow and other Russian cities. We do see brave Russians who are willing to look into the camera and say on the record that they do not support the war, that they do not believe Putin's lies, but we see far too many Russians who look into the camera and just recite what they heard on evening news shows the night before on state propaganda outlets and embrace conspiracy theories, even those who have family members in Ukraine and know that Ukraine is not governed by Nazis, but they've bought in to a lot of the propaganda. And so that's incredibly frustrating. But I think we've seen throughout our 70-year history that even when things appear bleak and the darkest, that change is often right around the corner. We're headquartered in Prague, in a city that we 70 years ago tried to reach through broadcast. It was illegal for us to even send journalists to report for our Czechoslovak service, and now we do. Much of our journalism have hundreds of journalists working from there, and that's the story again and again in many of the places that we now operate. These are places that we had no hope of reaching or reporting in directly decades ago. And so I think we're still optimistic about the possibility that as long as there are platforms that can provide truthful information, and as long as we can help with the technological access that many Russians now require to get truthful information, that change over time is possible. And the final thing I'll just say, leading an organization that's been targeted by Putin for many years, these actions that he's taken to exert complete information control are ultimately a sign of significant weakness. If he believed that his hold on the country was solid, he would not have felt the need to block so many independent outlets like he did in the early phase of the war and to spread such ridiculous lies to the public. And so I think that also should tell us something about what is truly going on right now within Russian society.
Absolutely, I can't agree more. Just a very brief last question, and you might argue that's not necessarily your domain, but I want to tie in your experience to the first panel on the suggestion of having this sort of EU disinformation war room. And I just wanted, there's been a number of ideas, what can we do and what more we can do, and I just wanted to see whether you have an idea in that department to fight disinformation and how we basically can better facilitate cooperation between those fighting disinformation.
I think it's an important question. We certainly make great use of all of the different public and private efforts to track disinformation campaigns, so our journalists can see some of the conspiracy theories and information that's being spread by propaganda outlets. But stepping back from those efforts, I think we just, and to pick up on what Keilu Chao was talking about, we need to remember the role of independent media outlets. Factual journalism with journalists doing their jobs under tough circumstances is incredibly important, not just in places like Russia or Belarus or Ukraine, but also within our own democracies. We need to make sure our public broadcasters remain independent, neutral. We need to make sure that small independent media outlets beyond the international public service media outlets have the funding they need to survive. We need more support for investigative journalism, and we need governments to actually stand up and criticize repressive regimes when they target journalists, when they jail journalists like Ihar Losik that Keilu mentioned, or Vladislav Yesepenko, one of our Ukrainian journalists who's been detained in Crimea for the last 13 months. And we need to make sure in democracies that our democratic leaders don't follow that same path of trying to insult journalists, to undermine their profession, which I've seen many times, unfortunately, in recent years, where politicians, including in the West, treat journalists as something other than independent arbiters of the truth. and that plays into the authoritarian narrative as well.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for your time and also the work you and your colleagues undertake at Radio Free Europe. I think it's truly invaluable, all the amount of work that goes into every piece of information that's shared on the network. And I hope we can continue to find ways to give everyone access to the truth. And this is why we are continuing with our next speaker. And I'm delighted to hear from the BBC and welcome Lillian Lander, the director of BBC World Services, which has been an absolute standard bearer for truth and integrity around the world. It is our pleasure to have you, Lillian, and I go straight with a very concrete and direct question, because what I'm wondering is, what are the challenges before you of fact-checking as a broadcasting organization when social media platforms are able to post content and information without any filters? And how do you manage and how do you balance out the need to feed 24 hours news while this news being accurate?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. You may not be able to see me. Let me allow access to my camera. That's excellent. Thank you. Thank you for this question. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Jamie, for making the last points that you've made, which were exactly what I wanted to hear and I would have wanted to see. We have huge challenges. You're absolutely right. For us, though, the primary driver in all this is accuracy. As was said earlier, disinformation has always been around. It was called propaganda, then fake news, now it's disinformation, misinformation, but social media has added quite a dangerous fuel to it. And it is precisely because social media can operate so freely and unchecked that our editorial policy at the BBC is to ensure accuracy by unpicking the data, testing the claims from all sides, and I really stress all sides, and verifying footage. So we use various techniques. We use open source intelligence techniques to verify user-generated content from across social media, geolocating footage and tracking where it came from. We've got a reality check team that publishes timely fact checks, particularly around elections, and we round up the most viral claims circulating on social media. But the challenges are huge. First, this kind of work is painstaking. It takes time. There are risks, and the risk is getting it wrong, which can happen. Another risk is amplification. Someone spoke about amplification earlier. Amplification meaning that by doing what we're doing, we're bringing undue attention to things that may be extreme or fringe and very harmful. So to avoid it, we check how popular the story is. We ask whether it is worthy of our attention as journalists, and in particular, whether we can add something to the sum of knowledge rather than repeating stories, rehashing the argument. And we can't fact check everything. So the rule of thumb is scale and severity. Now, BBC research has showed that a single piece of false news could be shared between millions of WhatsApp users before any mainstream news organization is even aware of it. And it's the speed and the spread across platforms, languages, countries, cultures that can be so astonishing. But an important point for me is, yes, of course, the fact-checking and debunking, but the best tool against misinformation is information. It's impartial, trustworthy, independent journalism, that kind of information. We've discovered that fact-checking does not generally reach those who are most exposed to disinformation. It usually goes to an audience that is already engaged, an audience that knows where to find you, that follows you. And so many of those affected directly by disinformation are simply not seeing our interventions, which is why what we need to do is constantly put good information in the same place. So you've got this parallel track of information and disinformation.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Very interesting.
Would it now work?
Would it now work?
I think maybe
Lillian
should
mute.
Should I mute?
Please, while I ask the question.
While I ask the question.
Thank you very much. I think like this, you're going to be able to hear my second question to you. That was very interesting. Thanks for presenting it in such a way. I would again want to ask a question on literacy and education, because I find, as I said before, with my question to Ms. Chow, we very often talk about it. It's mentioned in reports, but I kind of am worried that I fail to see the concrete steps that we walk the talk, so to say, whether that's within educational institutions or that's in different ways, that that platforms or traditional media and so on and so forth, or institutions would like to educate citizens. So how do you think we can build this more media literacy, basically, within education, within societies, and also older people who might be susceptible to disinformation online that fits basically their existing viewpoints? If you could give us some ideas and suggestions, I think it would be important for our work as MEPs. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be quite quick on this. The BBC puts a lot of resources and time into education. I think most of you would by now be quite familiar with the explainer videos that we call outside source that Ros does. These are very much kind of part and parcel of how we attempt to simply educate by informing, really. It's important to inform, and it's important to protect from disinformation, but it's also important to empower the youth and empower the our older audiences. So in terms of young people, we work with the BBC education project on media literacy to offer resources for young people. We've got a project called Young Reporter, where young people are kind of shown how to unpick a certain piece of information and put it back together again. You take a slightly different approach with older people, and you come in here through things that are of immediate concern to them. For instance, consumer news. We have had a story recently on scamming. Cyber criminals stole my identity, which did extremely well amongst older audiences. And it's about working on pieces that give tips to your audience, but importantly, it's the pieces that are about how we do it, how we go through unpicking, that are extremely popular with both older and younger. So a couple of videos how we verify social media posts from the war in Ukraine were extremely popular. And something interestingly that was quite shocking was a story that had 5 million views online. And that was the first person experience of a young woman whose mother did not believe her accounts of being shelled in Ukraine. The mother living in Russia, she lives in Ukraine. 5 million views, and a first-person pieces work very well usually. So we do work on a number of levels, and it is usually explaining, unpicking, and allowing our audiences to share into the work that we do. This is how we do it, and you take your audience with you. All of this kind of works in terms of education.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Lillian.
much.
Last very brief question from my side, because I'm in charge of the time, but I failed into making sure we're on time. I think it was Lena who asked once or twice some of the previous speakers about the future trends. And maybe if you could fit it in a minute, but what role do you see for broadcasters in the future when it comes to delivery, the facts, when it comes to accurate reporting? Because I find that that field is just developing so fast and so quickly that it's difficult to.
I agree with you. And as you say, you've already asked this question to two of my previous colleagues. So what I'm going to do is give myself the right to put in on the table an issue that is hugely important to me, and that should be hugely important to yourselves. And this is about disinformation tactics that are used in democracies. We've talked a lot about Russia. We've not talked enough about disinformation in democracies. And the most obvious example being what happened in the 2020 US elections, or frankly, in the most recent UK general election, where videos were manipulated, fake fact-check websites where their proxies were used, inauthentic networks. It is important to look in our own backyards, I think, and I don't know that we've done enough of that this afternoon. We've got something called, or we've researched something called disinformation for hire, which is where so-called strategic communications companies are used to spread propaganda, purposefully spread misinformation with the use of AI and algorithms. And I'm going to take 1 minute to quote the Oxford Internet Institute, which published a report on media manipulation, revealing that organized social media manipulation campaigns operate in 81 countries. This is not just Russia, and this is not just China. This is 81 countries, up from 70 countries in 2019, where global misinformation is actually being produced on an industrial scale by major governments and public relations firms and political parties. It has become a common strategy of cyber manipulation and part of political communication. It is personalized, it's produced on an industrial scale, and frankly, paid influencers are key because they have a trusted audience and they reach a different demographic. We are currently investigating how Russian misinformation is being spread using accounts of influencers in India. This is pretty bad. This is bad in countries where social media companies' moderation is poor and fact-checking is poor. But I do not think that we should take our eye away from this. The problem is huge and exists in Russia. The problem exists elsewhere and deserves our full attention. My apologies for deflecting your question, but I think that this was important enough for us to be aware of it.
Thank you very much, Lillian.
Thank you very much,
It was
Lillian.
extremely important. It's something that we have noticed, and the borders go way beyond Russia and China on that topic. And thanks for providing the concrete data and information coming out from this study. I also hope that the British government knows what a credit the BBC is to your country. And once again, thanks for joining us. And I would like to thank the next speakers for their patience. And we are going back back to the US, and I'm pleased to welcome Emerson T. Brooking from the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, which is doing some critical work in tracking disinformation, and we look forward to hearing from you and your insights. Actually, I've been asked from some members here and participants here in the room if they could as well take the floor to ask a couple of questions. So alongside me, I have Eline, who's a digital advisor at the EPP party, who has asked for the floor. And if anyone else would like to ask for the floor, please let me know and be brief. Eline.
Thank you very much, Ms. Neidel. Thank you very much, Mr. Brill, Mr. Emerson, for being with us, and found it very interesting so far. I have a couple of questions regarding, I think it was Ms. Landlord who referred to how we need to into our own backyard. So I was wondering if you find it difficult to distinguish between what is this information being spread by foreign autocracies and the one being spread by domestic actors, even within democracies. And also, we tend to often hear about how organizations like yours get to collaborate with platforms. And I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit what it looks like, whether they also give you enough access, timely access, or if anything could be improved in this type of cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emerson. I hope you're online with us.
I'm here, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I want to start with the question about distinguishing domestic and foreign disinformation, because it's always been a challenge. I think it's becoming more so. When we talk about identifying and attributing disinformation campaigns, the sort of a Platonic ideal of a disinformation campaign is some of what we saw during the 2016 US election, where there were sock puppet networks or botnets that were being coordinated out of the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. But that's really the exception to the rule. Far more often when we're studying these campaigns and thinking about how to describe them, or trying to describe foreign influence more broadly, we look at cases like two popular outlets in the United States, InfoWars and Zero Hedge, which over the course of several years republished thousands of articles from RT. They plagiarized these articles. And these weren't formal republication agreements, but rather a plagiarism and a copy pasting with the tacit understanding that the Russian state media would permit this content resharing. So these are the sorts of situations we encounter where there are foreign articles, foreign ideas, clear evidence of some foreign influence, but it's being distributed through domestic sources. And then complicating things even further is, in our experience, when there's a fast-moving event, like an election, or something where we very quickly need to determine if there's been foreign interference, contemporaneous attribution, that is, attribution to a foreign actor while it still matters, is always a deeply charged political challenge. And oftentimes, making an attribution to a foreign actor, it can generate a political backlash, but it doesn't necessarily create more public understanding as to distinguish foreign activities from the activities of domestic actors. So that's just an overview of the complexity when we talk about foreign and domestic activities. And then with regard to platform cooperation, the Digital Forensic Research Lab of the Atlantic Council was one of 3 organizations that piloted a program in 2018 with Facebook. We signed a non-disclosure agreement, and as a result, we had early access to some networks that Facebook had identified. But what this agreement meant in practice was that we were receiving lists of accounts which maybe internal Facebook security teams had identified, but our task was to try to corroborate their attribution. to bring our regional and language skills to the task to try to fill in the gaps. But beyond that list of accounts, we didn't have any more privileged access, nor did we have access to any internal company processes. And I'll say, as the debate around platform transparency has gone so much further in the last few years, I think the arrangement that our organization had arose because these companies were trying to do something quickly. But I don't think it's a scalable solution.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Aline has a follow-up question, but I just wanted to ask you, we've a number of times mentioned election cycles, and around election cycles, there's so much disinformation going on. And I believe the Atlantic Council ran a Ukraine task force during the last presidential elections in the country. So I wanted to know, what were some of the main disinformation messages that were part of this separate campaign, so to say, that was pushed by foreign actors during the election cycle?
Mm-hmm. So the sort of the top line message from Russian state entities and Russian adjacent entities was that the presidential election was an illegitimate process, that these elections were a sham, that they were being held to placate the West and particularly the United States, but that their audience was essentially foreign actors and foreign investors. It wasn't for the benefit of the people of Ukraine. And then the Russian propaganda efforts in 2019 also focused a lot on cherry picking statements of different organizations. Like there was a report by Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which noted some challenges in election administration. This was something which Kremlin sources focused on heavily, as they sort of they drew out the smaller points of criticism from this report, but sort of decontextualized it and cast it as the Ukrainian election processes happening contrary to European and international norms. In 2019, Russian government also focused a lot on the Ukrainian decision to bar Russian election observers, as well as the Ukrainian decision to close some polling places in Russia, which had previously been available to Ukrainian citizens who worked in the country, although those Ukrainian citizens still had other outlets through which to vote. And then finally, we saw in 2019 a shift in some Russian methods regarding social media manipulation. This was really the first time we saw significant evidence that Russia was seeking to purchase Facebook assets. That instead of trying to develop these inauthentic sock puppet networks from scratch, they were reaching out to people who already had established accounts, seeking to purchase them and then roll them into their broader propaganda effort. And also notably, although Facebook did take early action in 2019, there were many complaints from Ukrainian observers that it wasn't sufficient. And in fact, then candidate Zelensky opened a tip line where his supporters could, of their own accord, sort of coordinate and identify these suspected influence networks.
Thank you very much also for that last bit for reminding us what candidate Zelensky at the time did. I hate to rush my speakers, so I give you plenty of time to answer, but I'm afraid that would have to be your last question from me, even though I have a number of them. But we would like to have Stephen Braille also joining us. And I know in Brussels here is almost dinner time for some of us. So I'm worried that online we're going to lose slowly our audience. But I just wanted to ask you, how can you explain basically how disinformation fits with all other acts that aim to destabilize our societies or our institutions, whether we are talking about cyber threats, kinetic warfare? It's all part of the same toolbox, as I said in the beginning, and the same game plan. You know, it's very worry for us, because I think we need to look through various lenses, and all these things in the end fit together. And sometimes I think we look at them as separate issues. So your insights and that of the Atlantic Council would be important. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. It's an excellent question. And this is something that Mr. Wellner touched on wonderfully in his opening remarks as well. When we think about disinformation, we think about it principally as a force multiplier. In our experience, these disinformation and influence campaigns can be orchestrated on their own, but they're less effective when that's the case. And in particular, in the West, in English language media, as more people now are cognizant of foreign interference and foreign influence campaigns, these campaigns are often identified before they get significant traction. To give you one example, in the 2020 US election, the successor to the Russian Internet Research Agency did try to start new fake media outlets to manipulate US discourse. But it appears that they reached an audience in the low thousands before these efforts were identified and the websites were shut down. They simply weren't that effective. And in fact, when one goes back to what we think about as the most effective or spectacular disinformation campaigns, in their attacks on the 2016 US election, it was actually the hacking of the emails of the Clinton campaign and of the Democratic National Committee, the hacking of that material and the leaking and laundering of it through WikiLeaks, and then the amplification of that material through personas. What mattered most there was actually the hacking component. The disinformation and information manipulation was a useful layer atop it, but what had the most strategic impact was that hacking attack by Russian military intelligence. And in addition to cyber-enabled influence operations, we also see disinformation often used as an aggregate to military campaigns. During the Syrian civil war, Russian propaganda delegitimizing the white helmets, delegitimizing and misrepresenting the cause of Syrian rebels, these were things that were inseparable, I think, from Russian military actions. And we see that disinformation is much more effective when it's working in tandem with these operations. And I want to make one more point, since you have previously asked the greatest future threat or things to think about. And I just want to note that today, it appears quite likely that Elon Musk, American billionaire, will purchase Twitter for about $43 billion and take that company private. And so when I think about the greatest threats posed by disinformation and of platform governance over the next few years, I think we're seeing the start of a conservative reaction to the governance steps that have been taken by social media companies, but also by the governments of Europe and governments elsewhere in the world. We may potentially be looking at a broader fragmentation of the social media space. And I think with it will come profound new governance challenges. And potentially in future, the individuals and companies that run these powerful platforms may be less responsive to public pressure. And that's something I worry about quite a lot.
Thank you very much, Emerson, and thank you for nicely tying that future perspective, which is very important for us. I think we would like to have foresight and be prepared for what's coming. And this would allow me to move to Stephen Brill, the CEO of NewsGuard. You've created a tool that enables us to understand more about the sources of our news. And I very much like to thank you for your time and also for your patience, and excuse the slight delay. And I go directly with my first question, which is a very broad question, but I think not everybody that's joining us online or here in this room has the app on their devices. And so I would like you to briefly explain us basically what NewsGuard does. How can we download it, and how does it work? Because me and my team found it as a very useful tool, but perhaps not everyone's aware of. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, and good afternoon, and I will try not to delay the cocktail hour too much. News is based on a very old-fashioned idea called human intelligence, instead of artificial intelligence. We have a team of 40 journalists who have read, reviewed, and rated the news sites responsible for 95% of online engagement in the countries in Europe and the United States and Canada where we operate. And what they do is they apply 9 specific, strictly apolitical journalistic standards to those sites. There's a point score of 0 to 100. If you get 60 or above, you get a green, and below 60, you get a red. And what we do is we rate the overall reliability and trustworthiness of news sites based on these 9 criteria. The result of that is that unlike fact checking, we achieve scale, and we basically pre-bunk myths and hoaxes that are out there. The best example being, or one example being, before the COVID pandemic, there were several news sites that said that the 5G technology was causing cancer. And that caused a lot of lots of concern in the technology community. There were people attacking utility workers. Then in January of 2020, those same sites pivoted smartly to saying that 5G causes COVID-19. They already had our red rating even before we updated what's called our nutrition label, which is where we explain our rating. So the way it works is if you have our browser extension, which Microsoft has made available to all the users of its Edge browser, if you have our browser extension, you can download it. And when you get a Facebook feed or a Twitter feed or a LinkedIn feed or do a Google search or a Bing search or anything else, our red and green icons will appear next to every URL, or 95% of them if they're news information. And when you hover over that URL and that red or green icon, you will see the rating, and you can read the 2,000 to 4,000 word nutrition label if you want to get all the information. Everything about what we do is totally transparent. We explain our ratings. We provide the bios of the people who did the rating. It's usually a group effort for each site of 6 to 8 people. And one of the things I'll just add to the prior speaker's statement, where he said he's worried about the social media platforms becoming less responsive. I don't see how they could be less responsive. Right now, as we speak, there are dozens and dozens of websites that are promoting Russian propaganda, that are on the social media platforms, that are in Facebook feeds. They're getting ads that are enabled by Google, which is what finances them. So it's hard to imagine a world in which these platforms could be less responsive.
Thank you very much. I think this gives us a very good overview of the work that NewsGuard does. Eileen also has a question for you. Eileen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Yes, I was wondering if you could tell us what you've observed in terms of the impact that you've made on how some organizations have changed their behavior as a result of your work. And again, I would like to ask you as well as Ms. Maydell, you've asked a few speakers, what do you think we can do more of to really ensure that we can improve digital literacy? Because education, it's not a very sexy topic because you only see the results in the long term, but I really believe that's very important. What can we do more of? And especially given in the EU, that's a national competence, what would be your recommendations? Thank you.
Well, we believe is the more information people get about the sources that are feeding them the news, the more they can ask their own questions. We don't believe in blocking, anything. Everything we do is totally transparent. We're not proposing that Twitter take down sites that we rate red. We're simply proposing that Twitter allow people to see that nutrition label and make their own decisions. So we now have a program where we're providing the browser extension at a deep, deep discount to public schools across the countries where we operate, and teachers are eagerly adopting our form of news literacy, which is giving students those criteria and the information. We also have a pro bono program in public libraries, where, as you know, lots of people get their internet access by going to the public library and using the computers there. There are more than 800 public libraries that have that now use the NewsGuard browser extensions. And as for the transparency of what we do, we try to hold ourselves completely accountable. And by being transparent, we want news sites to game our system. We are the opposite of an algorithm. Facebook and Twitter and YouTube all rate the reliability of news and information sites. They just don't tell anybody what those ratings are, or who's rating them, or how those ratings are derived. We're the opposite of that. In addition, we call every single website that we rate for comment. And if we're going to say anything bad about them, we ask them for comment. And both before and after we publish our rating, we have seen now approximately 2,000 of the 7,500 sites we've rated have done something to change their rating and get a better rating, which we love. We want people to game our system. We want a website to say, gee, if I had a corrections policy, and if I held myself accountable for mistakes I make, I'd get a higher rating from NewsGuard. Well, hallelujah, that's why we started the company.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And perhaps a last question to you, while combining two of the topics where we've seen a lot of disinformation, COVID, and also election campaigns and during election time. You have done with NewsGuard a lot of work on to spot the anti-vax disinformation. And I was wondering whether there are some similarities or differences between the kind of disinformation that was used from the anti-vaxxers, the disinformation that comes from autocracies when it's election time, for example.
Well, there's one slight difference. With healthcare misinformation, and by the way, that is the largest category of misinformation, even before the pandemic. And the reason is that's where the money is, because programmatic advertising, which is advertising by algorithm, we found something like 2,000 blue chip brand names in Europe and the United States were financing this stuff by inadvertently placing their ads there. And we have a partnership, as you may know, with the World Health Organization, where we're trying to persuade advertisers to use our filters to keep their ads off of those sites. When it comes to election misinformation, there's a lot of that is in it for the money also, because programmatic advertising will go to something, with a crazy headline about Stop the Steal, but also a lot of that is motivated by politics. Just to give you an example, we have found dozens of so-called local news sites in the United States, which are posing as local news sites, but are financed by politicians on the left and right, secretly financed by them to look like local news sites, but they tout their favorite local candidates. And that is a real problem. And that's another example where our news literacy efforts will work, because if that has a red rating from us, if someone looks at it, they will say, maybe I shouldn't, maybe that's not a site where I should get the political news that I want. We have a study done by Gallup, and we have other studies that say that if something has one of our red ratings, people are far less likely to share it. And if it has a green icon, they are more likely to share it. So we're really gratified by that.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your insights. And it's great to see those practical examples of how we can, on one hand, better understand the news and their sources, but also have those sort of health ratings or nutrition ratings that you've mentioned. And I'm sure many will probably be downloading NewsGuard as we speak or after the end of the meeting, because there is no actual drinks party afterwards. There's supposed to be tea and coffee, but perhaps it's a little bit late for that, to be honest. But I would like to thank and wrap up everyone that has participated today. First of all, for your dedication and time, to our participants who are experts on the field and who have given us a lot of insights. I kind of feel it's been about 2 hours and a half, but it feels like the insight we got is like we've talked for 20 hours. So I think there's one thing that's clear to me. It's fighting disinformation. It's not just for politicians or platforms. Often platforms say it's for politicians, and politicians say it's for platforms. I think it's a responsibility that falls on all of us in various ways. And I think this summit today and this meeting was inspired by the terrible events happening in Ukraine, and in a way the people of Ukraine are an inspiration to all of us, but it's time that we do simply our part, and this is why we would like that this meeting today follows up with concrete action. So as a first thing we'll do is engage regularly with the European Commission to see how we can push forward the idea of a concrete and regular forum for discussion and action among the community that works on fighting disinformation, because there is still so much to be discussed. And even today, we heard from the speakers a number of concrete points and policies. It will be difficult for me to wrap up on every single key suggestion that was given, but perhaps I would like to highlight a couple of them. One, starting with implement the Kognete report on disinformation. The second one, that we need even more growing resources and cooperation on the field. And that also ties nicely and for the need for more Western and democratic unity. As I said, I think it's today more than ever. We need to see this cooperation blossoming. We've also heard from Alexander the need for transparency, but it has to lead to accountability. And also from a number of you, the importance that we need to look into our own backyard. And then finally, looking into the future, the fragmentation of social media space and its governance, and how we need to pay close attention. So one more time, I would like to thank you for participating today, and I hope we will find a moment to convene again, perhaps not necessarily organizing such an event, but meeting together to discuss more concretely how we have advanced on some of these points and what more we can do, because we don't simply want to be a talking shop. We want to see action, and this is why in the coming days and weeks we will come up with a concrete written we can call it paper, we can call it a wrap-up of the suggestions and proposals and the observations that we've had from today, to see how best we can deploy them in order to enact real but also meaningful and lasting change. Because when we speak about Ukraine, this is our greatest challenge today, but we know that the threat disinformation presents is a much broader one to our democracies, and this is why I would like us, just like today, we had our different views and our suggestions. It will be very important for our democracies to continue working together because my team, while we prepare for this summit, we were reminded of the slogan of the Washington Post, which I'm sure many of you know, that democracy dies in darkness. And I think this disinformation is exactly an attempt to bring darkness to our democratic societies. But I think our job as policymaker and the job from everyone we've heard today is to actually bring the light. So if we manage to do that, we have fighted that darkness. So I would like to wish everyone a very nice evening. And indeed, perhaps outside there is some refreshments for the ones that are here in the room. Thank you very much. And I look forward to continuing the conversation and the actions together. Thank you.